jam to pair with cheese. Like, this is, and it's $9. Like, this is a terrible idea. And I was just like, I almost like lost it because I was like, I'd been in the kitchen for like 12 hours. I had like orange under my fingernails, and I was polite, but I was like, the reason it's $9 is because I peeled and cut every single one of these oranges. And she was like, oh.
Hello! Welcome to The Corner Table, a Capital Times podcast about food and drink in Madison. When Matt and Clare Stoner Fehsenfeld started their food business in 2009, customers weren't quite sure what to make of them. Quince Apple's little jars of fig and black tea preserves and caramelized shallot confit weren't very sweet, and pairing them with cheese seemed a little bit strange. Fast forward to now, and Quince Apple preserves can be found in specialty shops in nearly every state in the country. I'm your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians, and this week on the podcast, I talk with Matt about how their Eastside Madison food company has been growing, how they come up with new recipes, and why the government classifies Quince Apple as a pickle business. Stay tuned. Welcome to the studio, Matt.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about who Quince Apple is and how you got started?
Yeah, so Quince Apple is a small artisan, primarily a preserves company here in Madison that my wife Clare and I started in 2009. So it's been almost like 9 years now, which is kind of crazy. We started here very small, and we've slowly grown over those 9 years to the point now where we sell stuff pretty much in all 50 states.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's kind of crazy.
What did you do before Quince Apple? How did you decide to start it?
So I've made preserves since I was a kid. It's always been a passion of mine, but I never really thought it would turn into an actual job or a career. But so right before we had Quince Apple, I was actually working at Potter's Crackers, another local artisan food company here. And then before that, I worked in some restaurants and actually went to culinary school at Madison College here as well. So,
how did you come up with sort of your original lineup of preserved types or flavors?
Yeah, so like I said, I've always sort of had this as a hobby, and I've always sort of tinkered with making preserves, and I've always really liked the kind of a more European style preserve, which is not super sweet, and stuff that you can pair with, not just breakfast, so more savory stuff like cheese and meats and things. And so, before Quince Apple was like a real legit business, I was making it for friends and family, and so my wife Claire and I, we did sort of a holiday thing for, just for some friends. We were like, oh, we should like sell some jars. It'd be kind of a fun project. And so we sent out an email, to like make my parents and my aunts and uncles or whatever. It ended up getting like 200 jars worth of orders, and it was just like insane, which we were completely unprepared to do. We were like in our kitchen for all of my cousins and whatever else. So and so that is sort of how it got. And then we were like, wait a second, maybe people actually will buy these things. And it was actually those products that we sort of did the best with in that Christmas thing that we ended up having as our initial lineup.
Do you remember what some of those original flavors were?
Yeah, so that we still make them. It's so our fig and black tea, which is sort of our most popular. Our orange marmalade with lemons, which is like probably my personal favorite, and then shallot and red wine. And so that's probably our most savory preserve, which is slow cooked caramelized shallots and red wine, and yeah.
That's the one that I look forward to on cheese plates.
Yeah, it's like one of it's the one that's like. It's not like your entry preserve necessarily for a lot of people, but it's one of my favorites.
One of the things that I remember when I was taking a tour of your facility over on Baldwin years ago is that you were sort of trying to figure out the balance between being really small batch and artisan and labeling every jar yourselves and being able to scale up a little bit. So can you talk a little bit about that process of how you learned to grow?
For sure. If this is something that we have put a lot of thought into and have tried to be really intentional in the way that we grow. Like I say, when we first started, we would sell into like 3 stores, and that felt totally overwhelming to keep those 3 stores stocked. And now we sell in, many more across the country. And in order to do that, we've had to scale up production, but we've tried to figure out, what are the areas that can be scaled without affecting the quality. So, we used to literally label every single jar by hand. Like, I would put a sticker on every single jar, and then Claire would make sure it was straight, and then I would stamp it with the batch code, and then we would put it in a box. And you can, that's like, it seems crazy now, but like it seems really important, right? It's like every jar we make needs to be. Well, what we sort of realized is that, like, okay, there's a lot of steps to make a jar of preserves. Some of those things, like, there's a very specific artisan technique that needs to be done, but there's not an artisan way to put a sticker on a jar, right? So we're like, wait a second, we should probably just buy a machine to put the stickers on, right? The customer, that doesn't really affect the quality at all. So every step of the way, I think about making a jar of preserves probably has, maybe 200 discrete steps. So which of those can we use tools and machines to make it easier without affecting the quality, and which still really need to be by hand? Something that we've toyed with over the years is trying to get a machine to fill the jars. And we've had some different filling machines that we've tried over the years, some of them pretty expensive machines, and they can't replicate what we can do with a ladle and a funnel. So still, every single jar we make, we make up to 800 jars a day. Every single jar is hand ladled and funneled, because there's just no replacement for, like, when you go in with the ladle, you can get exactly the right mix of fruit and syrup, and a machine just can't do that.
Are you doing limited run batches or sort of bespoke, preserves for this particular restaurant or that particular place? Do you do that kind of thing?
We do. We used to do more of it. Right now, the only store that we do it for is Fromagination here in town. We hope to get back to it, but it's actually largely because of changes in the FDA regulations that has made it harder to do. Basically, the amount of paperwork and investment that needs to go into developing a recipe has grown dramatically since we started. And so it just makes it a little harder to do. You can't just say, like, oh, this is what I'm going to make, and I'll send it to you this week. It's like a several-month process of getting the recipe vetted and tested by a commercial lab and then sent to FDA. And so it's hard. It makes it hard to kind of come up with new flavors just on the spot.
And that's just for the preserves. I mean, I've heard about that kind of regulation in terms of, like, charcuterie, but it strikes me that meat processing could potentially have more pathogens involved in it than preserves. And when you're preserving, you're already sort of following, a code or a method that's going to make sure you're not going to have things explode on you.
Exactly.
You're not going to have things fermenting in there that are, going to make you sick. So that's, yeah.
It's interesting. Well, we're actually a funny product because, the laws were written, in the 50s and 60s. So they're kind of out of date. So their definition of what a preserve is, we actually don't even qualify for. So this is something that when we started was a sort of an issue. We applied for a jam and jelly and preserves license, and we're denied. We're like, why? Like, we had checked, we had done everything, and they were like, oh, you don't have enough sugar in your product to qualify as a jam. Like, this is not a real jam. So we're actually, technically, according to the FDA, we make pickles. Which is totally bizarre. And we're like, because they can't conceive of a product that doesn't have, 60% sugar by weight or whatever. So, yeah, so we end up getting regulated in really weird ways, which is a whole sort of boring but very detailed and complicated saga.
What preserves do you make for Fromagination?
So they make it's actually their recipe. They do a cranberry relish, which is really good. And so they sell it in store. They had been making it themselves and putting it on their sandwiches because it's on their signature sandwich. But so many people were requesting to buy it, but they didn't obviously have the capacity to make it. So we've been actually making that, I think, for them for probably 8 years or so.
Nice. Yeah. You're like a local co-packer.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember a few years ago now, I think, when the syrups came out.
Yeah.
And there was like a tart cherry grenadine.
Yeah.
And the citrus is one of my favorites. There was also one, I think, with hops, if I remember correctly. They make mixing a cocktail at home that's interesting really easy without having to have a gazillion fancy liqueurs. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about developing those syrups.
That was exactly the idea. It's great to go out to a bar and get an amazing cocktail, but they've got so many tools and so many ingredients and so many things available to them that it's hard to keep you're not going to have 100 bottles in your home bar. So we were trying to come up with stuff that's, you could make an easy cocktail at home that was really good. And so, it really just kind of, the rhubarb hops is the one that has hops in it. That was actually the first one that we made. And actually, originally, I was trying to make a preserve, a rhubarb preserve, and it just, like, the rhubarb kept kind of cooking and turning to mush, and it was tannic and very much not good. And so I was like, oh, maybe I'll strain it and make a jelly. But it didn't set up, and then I was like, wait a second, this would be really good with gin. And I put it in, and I was like, this is so good. And that is sort of how we do product development. It's really a trial and error process. We usually have an idea that we start with of, maybe a fruit that we want to use or a certain flavor combination that we're interested in exploring. But that's almost never where we end up. So this sort of thing where we're like, oh, let's make a new rhubarb preserve, and then we end up introducing a whole new line of cocktail syrups. Maybe 5% of the batches that we make ever turn into the thing that we want it to. So it's fun, to be constantly experimenting and coming up with new stuff is one of my favorite parts of the job.
What's in the citrus syrup?
So the citrus has lemon juice, lime juice, lemon zest and lime zest, lime leaves, and lemongrass, and then a little bit of sugar.
That's really cool.
Yeah, it's super tart. That's the one that's the most tart. It's kind of like our sour mix, but what I love about that one is that, like, the nose on it is so nice. It's so fragrant and fresh, and it's not just like sour. It has all these sort of interesting complexities with all of those different sort of citrusy notes.
Are there batches of preserves that you've made when trying to test out a new potential recipe that you just could never get to work? Like a couple of things that you wish you could put out, but they just never really came together?
Yeah. Well, so we have a preserve that we sell now, which is tart cherry and white tea, which almost was that. That one, I literally felt like it was going to kill me to get that product released. And I'm glad we did. I mean, it won a Good Food Award last year, and it's one of my favorites. It's made with all Dougherty County tart cherries, but it took almost 2 years to get that product right, and it was probably batch 70 or whatever that we finally nailed it. But there is a product. So we used to make and sell a strawberry rosemary preserve, which I love. One of my favorite preserves we've ever made. But we had to discontinue it, basically because in order to make, we could make it in a small enough batch. You could make a batch of 6 jars. But if you want to make a batch of 100 jars, which is about the size of each of our batches, which isn't that much, the strawberries would start to just turn to mush. You have to use really nice, ripe heirloom strawberries to get the flavor that we wanted, but they would just turn to mush by the time the pot would come up to a boil. And so at a really small pot, you can just crank the heat, bring it to a boil, quick, dump it into a jar and seal it. But you can't do that at a slightly larger scale. So that's the one that I still am always how can we solve that problem? But I don't know if we can or not. Yeah. So I mean, it's just there are sometimes limitations to things that you want to do or things that you want to explore. And I've never wanted to be oh, we can't do that. I'm just sort of I haven't figured out how to do it yet.
The tart cherry and white tea, what made it so difficult?
Well, so basically what would happen is it's an interesting texture. So it's like a jelly, but it's sort of a light jelly, and then it's whole pitted cherries floating in it. And it's got white tea and green tea and jasmine in it. So it's really light and floral and delicate, and it's a beautiful preserve, but we just couldn't get the set consistently right. And so we use a pectin, mentioning that we don't have that much sugar in our preserves relative to conventional jams. And so the pectin we use is activated instead of by sugar, which is sort of what traditional pectins are. That's how their gel gets formed. Ours is formed by calcium. And so a lot of fruit has natural calcium in it, and so it'll naturally gel it up.
Apples.
Exactly. Cherries, it turned out, do not have almost any calcium in it. And so what we discovered was so literally I would make a batch at home, and I make a pretty big batch. I'd make like a 40-jar batch at home out of a big stock pot, and it would turn out great. And then I'd take it over to work, and I'd do the exact same thing at work, and it would just be like totally not set up at all. And I literally felt like I was going crazy. And I was like trying to like look up peer-reviewed articles on pectin formation. It was like a nightmare. Well, what I figured out is that our house was on a different well than our work. And so I looked up the water report, and the hardness at our home well was like twice as much as the hardness at the work well. So I was like, oh, good, and that's calcium. And so, and you're making it, there's a lot of water in that one because you're making the tea first, and so once we figured that out, then we had a solution. But it was just sort of like, it's those sort of things like, oh, it's the same city water, but it's a different well. And that obviously took me forever to figure out, but it's these kinds of things where it's just like, if you make a batch, if you're making 20 jars at home, and 10 of them don't turn out, no problem. Like all your friends get 1 jar instead of 2 jars, but you can't be throwing away half a batch when you're trying to actually sell them. So,
how many products are you currently working on a weekly basis? Like, how many do you release on a weekly basis?
Let's see. Well, we have, so there's like 5 syrups and 9 preserves, or 8 preserves and 1 mostarda. We usually don't make that many in a week, because we've got inventory. But so we usually make like 7 batches every week, and a batch is 4 pots. So that's another thing. We haven't changed our pot size since we started. We just kind of do a lot of them. And so that, usually on average we'll make like 6 or 7 different types of products a week.
Where are you based now?
So we're on the Isthmus. So when we very first started, we were at Madison Enterprise Center, yes, which is on Baldwin Street, South Baldwin, and is run by Commonwealth Development. It's a business incubator. And actually, when we very first started, we were there, but we were subletting kitchen space from Potter's. I was mentioning that I worked at Potter's Crackers, so I would make crackers all day, and then Clare would come over, and we would make preserves until the middle of the night. We did that for almost a year. And then we built out a space there, and then slowly grew. By the time we left, we had 3 suites there. And now we're at Main Street Industries, which is on East Main, 931 East Main. It's sort of the sister building. It's another business incubator, but it's sort of like where you go when you graduate. And so you got a longer-term lease. And yeah, so it's great. We're right on the Isthmus, and we've got a nice production facility and office and warehouse there.
I noticed recently that you purchased Treat brands, which is delicious sugary nuts and salty nuts and spicy nuts. And I wonder why you decided to do that, and kind of what's next for you with working with Treat.
Yeah. We're really excited about this. So we've known Sarah, who started and has run Treat for the last 6 years. She's been based in Milwaukee. And so we've done a lot of work with her. We're in a lot of the same stores. We include her stuff in our gift baskets. So we've been like huge fans of Treat and Sarah and the product and the brand that she's built. And so she actually approached us about this. I think she was at a point where she was like, do I want to take this to the next level and kind of push it out into distribution, or am I ready to kind of explore a new thing? And I think, for Claire and I, we feel like we want to continue to grow the business. We feel like over the last 9 years, we've built a really solid foundation, like the back-end foundation for running a small food business. We've got the production processes in place. I was talking about FDA and regulation stuff. Like, that's not easy. That's taken us a few years to kind of get a full grasp on all the new regulations. So we've got that in place. We have a great network of distributors and a great sales infrastructure in place. But we don't want to necessarily grow the preserves to be in like every Walmart and Target in the country, right? Like if we feel like that starts to undermine the brand, and certainly we couldn't produce in this sort of artisan way if we were going to produce at that volume. So there's sort of a natural cap to the size of how big we want the preserves to get, right? And so we felt like, well, this is an interesting way to continue to grow the business, to grow another artisan food brand. Treat is sort of right at the point that we feel like Quince Apple was at just a few years ago, where super strong brand, well-known in the Midwest, doing really well in like small independent specialty shops, but sort of struggling to figure out how to break into distribution and sort of grocery stores on a national basis. And we've managed to do that with the preserves, so we felt like it was an opportunity to sort of take everything we've learned and then do it again. I think it's going to be a cool project.
You do a lot of vending at markets and events like the cheese competition, I think, where I saw you last.
Yeah.
And I wonder, there maybe is still some kind of communication that maybe you need to do about, like, yes, these are preserves, but they're not as sweet as you might expect. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about those customer interactions, like the kind of questions. Are you getting fewer questions or different questions than you used to when you first started? Was there a lot of explaining that you needed to do kind of right up front?
When we first started, people were like, what are these? And like, why would you quit your job to make these? You're crazy. I remember being at a grocery store. This was like maybe like 6 months after we had started. And I was doing a demo and was going to sampling. It was our orange marmalade, which is like super labor intensive to make. It's very difficult to make. And I think I had just finished a batch or something and went straight to the store. And a person came up to me and she was like, jam to pair with cheese, like this is, and it's $9? Like, this is a terrible idea. And I was just like, I almost like lost it, because I was like, I'd been in the kitchen for like 12 hours. I had like orange under my fingernails, and I was polite, but I was like, the reason it's $9 is because I peeled and cut every single one of these oranges. And she was like, oh, okay. But we don't get that kind of stuff anymore. Like, I feel like we were in a different place as a sort of a food community and as a country. Now when I say to people like, oh, they're preserves for pairing with cheese, people are like, oh, cool, okay, that's great. Whereas before people would look at me like I was, telling them to eat fish heads or something. It was like just so bizarre to them. It's much easier to talk to consumers and customers now than it was then. I just think there's like the base level of knowledge about food has really increased.
I hope that's true. I think that's true too. I both hope and I think.
I don't think it's where, I think it should be, and certainly nowhere near where I want it to be. It does feel like it's moving in the right direction. Like, when we first started, we sold in Madison and Chicago and Milwaukee and in New York and Boston and San Francisco, like places with established food cultures, big cities, and had success in those places. And it was really hard to get places outside of those like large metropolitan areas. But now, we have stores in Fairbanks, Alaska that sell our products and do well with it, and I don't think that would have been the case when we started. So I'm hopeful that we're moving in the right direction, though we still have a long way to go.
Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. It was really fun to be here.
This has been The Corner Table, a podcast about food and drink in Madison, produced by the Capital Times. Our music was composed by Patrick Christians. For restaurant reviews, food features, and news, visit captimes.com and subscribe to The Corner Table on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook at Corner Table Podcast. I am your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians. One of my favorite cocktails to make with Quince and apple syrup is a Jack Rose, which is about 2 ounces of Applejack and 3/4 ounce each of lemon juice and Quince and Apple's tart cherry grenadine. Shake that with ice, and cheers!